At 7:42 a.m. on August 17, 1943, Technical Sergeant James McKenna crouched beneath the shadow of a P-38 Lightning at Dobadura Airfield in New Guinea, watching his pilot prepare for what looked like a one-way flight. The man he served under was Lieutenant Robert Hayes, 23 years old, with 6 combat sorties and not a single enemy aircraft to his name. The Japanese had scrambled 18 Mitsubishi A6M Zeros to intercept the morning patrol. Hayes was flying straight into their teeth. For 8 months, McKenna had lived and breathed P-38s. He knew their strengths and secrets: twin engines, twin booms, a predator at altitude, built for speed and power. But buried within that brilliance was a flaw that had become a death sentence for countless young Americans. The Lightning could not turn with a Zero. The Japanese fighter was lighter, sharper, more agile. It could complete a full turn in half the time a P-38 required. In combat, that difference decided everything. The manuals were clear: never turn with a Zero. Keep your altitude. Dive fast, strike hard, then climb away. Hit and vanish. Never stay to dogfight. Hayes had tried it 5 times already, and it had failed him 5 times. The Zeros were too disciplined, too clever. They provoked the Americans into turning, slipped inside their radius, and tore them apart. In just 6 weeks, the 5th Air Force had lost 37 Lightnings. Nearly all were downed after being trapped in turning battles that no amount of courage could win. McKenna had seen too many of those pilots die. Good men, barely more than boys. They climbed into their cockpit smiling, certain they'd return, and either came back in pieces or not at all. Official reports blamed poor flying. Instructors said it was a failure to follow doctrine, but McKenna knew that wasn't true. The issue wasn't the men, it was the machine. Inside every P-38 ran a complex web of cables controlling the ailerons, looping through the twin booms, around pulleys, and back to the wings. Those cables carried the smallest trace of slack, about 3/8 of an inch at full deflection. It sounded insignificant, but in the air, that fraction created a delay between the pilot's movement and the aircraft's reaction. At high speed, the lag vanished. At low speed, during tight turns, it could mean the difference between rolling inside a Zero or becoming its next kill. 2 months earlier, McKenna had brought this up with the engineering officer. The officer shrugged it off. Cable tension was within specification, he said. The factory allowed that margin. Adjusting it would void the warranty. Besides, no field mechanic could modify flight controls without Lockheed's approval, and Lockheed was 7,000 miles away in California. So McKenna broke every rule in the Army Air Force's manual. From the wreck of another plane, he pulled a piece of piano wire, cut it to 6 inches, bent it into a Z, and installed it as a tensioner on Hayes's left aileron cable. The fix took 8 minutes. It added 4/10 of a pound of tension. It erased the slack. The inspection team never noticed. They were too focused on engines, oil, and ammunition. McKenna said nothing. He simply watched as Hayes rolled toward the runway, lifted into the morning haze, and vanished into the blue. What happened over the next 17 minutes would change the way every P-38 in the Pacific would be flown. The first pilot McKenna had lost to a Zero was Lieutenant David Chen, July 9, 1943. Chen had been in the Pacific for just 3 weeks. McKenna had serviced his plane daily. They talked about home, Chen from Sacramento, McKenna from Long Beach. Both had worked on cars before the war.
That morning, Chen lifted off at 0615 for a sweep over Leh. 2 hours later, he came back with 3 bullet holes in his left boom and a story about a Zero that had nearly ended him. He'd tried to roll out and dive exactly as the manual said, but the Lightning lagged. The stick moved and the wings hesitated. The Zero nearly had him, saved only by his wingman's gunfire. McKenna examined the bullet holes, close together, perfectly grouped. The Japanese pilot had anticipated Chen's movement precisely. That shouldn't have been possible if the Lightning had rolled instantly, unless the delay had given the Zero just enough time to aim. Chen's aircraft went in for repairs. McKenna never saw him again. 3 weeks later, he heard Chen was dead, shot down over Rabaul while flying another P-38. Same mistake, same outcome. The aircraft couldn't roll fast enough to escape. The next man was Captain William Morrison, a squadron leader, calm, skilled, with 11 kills to his name. He knew every strength and weakness of the Lightning and flew it like a craftsman. On August 3rd, his formation met 8 Zeros at 12,000 feet above Oro Bay. Morrison brought down 1 Zero on his first pass, then banked around for another strike. 2 enemy fighters reversed on him mid-turn. McKenna later heard the radio chatter. Morrison tried to roll inverted and pull a split S to escape, but called out that his controls felt sluggish. The Zero stayed with him through the maneuver and tore him apart at 4,000 feet. His wingman reported that it looked as if Morrison's aircraft wasn't answering his commands, like he was wrestling the stick, not flying it. Morrison died in the crash. His crew chief, Rodriguez, a Texan and a close friend of McKenna's, refused to believe it was pilot error. He examined the wreckage piece by piece. Engine calibrations, control rigging, cable tensions, every reading fell inside factory tolerances. The official paperwork said pilot mistake. Rodriguez didn't buy it. Neither did McKenna. By mid-August, McKenna had watched 17 pilots die. Some he'd known well, others only in passing during pre-flight checks. But he'd signed off on every one of their aircraft, watched them taxi out, lift into the air, and never return. Those who did make it back told the same story. The Lightning felt heavy in sharp turns, as if there was a heartbeat of delay between moving the stick and seeing the wings respond. Most believed that was just how the plane flew, a large fighter with sluggish controls. But McKenna knew better. He'd felt that hesitation in his own hands while tightening the cables.
That faint slack. He started listening for it, the tone a cable made when it was plucked during maintenance. Loose ones hummed dull and low. Tight ones gave a crisp twang. McKenna could tell the difference instantly. Every P-38 he serviced gave that same faintly loose note, technically within specification, but still off. One evening, not long after Morrison's death, he mentioned it to Rodriguez. Rodriguez asked what could be done. McKenna told him the truth. Nothing official. Fixing it would mean breaking regulations that could get them both court-martialed. The problem wasn't ignorance. Every pilot knew the doctrine by heart. Every briefing drilled it in. Never turn with a zero. Use your speed, use your altitude, strike and climb away. The strategy was sound on paper, but battlefields didn't follow manuals. Lieutenant Robert Hayes had been stationed in New Guinea for 2 months, 23 years old, farm boy from Iowa. 6 combat missions, no kills. Not because he lacked skill, but because he followed the rules, and the rules never gave him a clean shot. On his 3rd mission, Hayes dove from altitude on a Zero, reaching 400 miles per hour, attacking from the sun exactly as instructed. He lined up for a deflection shot. The Zero snapped-rolled left and dove away. Hayes tried to follow, but his Lightning felt sluggish, like it was wading through molasses. By the time he leveled the nose, the enemy had vanished. He climbed back up frustrated, not a single round fired. The 4th mission was worse. Hayes and his wingman ambushed 2 Zeros 15,000 feet. He fired the first burst and missed. The target rolled sharply right. As Hayes followed, his wingman shouted over the radio, 2 more Zeros diving from above. Hayes tried to roll level and break away, but the aircraft lagged again just long enough for one of the enemy to send a 3-second burst into his right boom. 20mm shells ripped through but didn't explode. Still, the near miss shook him. He disengaged and limped home, trailing smoke. On the 5th mission, Hayes lost his closest friend, Lieutenant Thomas Parker, 21, from Boston. They had trained together, eaten together, and flown side by side. On August 14th, Parker got separated from the formation during a chaotic fight over Finchhofen. 2 Zeros closed in behind him. He tried everything, rolls, reversals, scissors, but they stayed locked on. Hayes heard him over the radio, voice breaking with panic, shouting that his plane wouldn't turn fast enough. Then came gunfire, a scream, silence. That night, no one in the squadron slept. Parker's cot stayed untouched. His gear was packed and sent home. His P-38 was listed as a combat loss. The maintenance notes claimed no mechanical failure. The official cause,
pilot error during evasive action. But McKenna knew better. He'd worked on that aircraft that very morning. The engines had been perfect. The cables were tight, by regulation at least. The airplane was flawless, and Parker was gone. When Parker died, McKenna finally understood. That split-second lag in the controls, that tiny looseness the manuals called acceptable tolerance, had killed Parker, just as it had taken Morrison, Chin, and 14 other pilots before them. What haunted him most wasn't the paperwork or the reports. It was the smell. Every dawn, the maintenance line reeked of aviation fuel, scorched metal, and hydraulic oil. It was the scent of war in motion, of machines being readied for combat. Some would return, others would vanish into the jungle haze. And every morning, McKenna stood there again, breathing it in, fixing more airplanes that he knew might not answer fast enough to save the men who flew them. On the humid evening of August 16th, Lieutenant Hayes walked into the hangar. McKenna was hunched over the P-38 assigned to him, tools spread across the floor. Hayes asked quietly if there was anything at all that could make the Lightning roll faster. Regulation or not, he didn't care. He just wanted a chance to survive. McKenna looked up and saw more than exhaustion in the young man's eyes. He saw fear, raw and honest, the look of someone who already sensed his own death closing in. McKenna told him to return in the morning. He'd try something. That night, McKenna stayed alone in the hangar long after everyone else had gone to their bunks. Past 2,300 hours, the base was still and heavy with tropical heat. The only sounds were distant generators and insects tapping against the overhead lights. He removed the access panel from Hayes' left boom. The metal was still warm from the day's sun. Inside, the aileron cable stretched through a series of pulleys toward the tail. He grabbed it with both hands and pulled. There it was, a fraction of slack, barely noticeable but enough to delay a man's survival by a heartbeat. From his tool bag, he pulled a short piece of high-tensile piano wire, salvaged weeks earlier from a wrecked Lightning. He had kept it without reason until now. Sitting cross-legged on the concrete, he bent it with pliers into a rough Z shape. The wire fought back, slicing his thumb when it slipped. Blood slicked his grip, but he kept going. 8 minutes later, the tensioner was ready. The idea was simple. Install it in line to preload the cable, removing the play the manuals allowed. The installation was worse. The space was cramped, lit only by his jittering flashlight. Metal edges scraped his arm as he worked, one-handed, sweat trickling down his spine. He disconnected the cable, fumbled with the clevis pin, dropped it into the boom and spent minutes feeling in the dark until he found it again. His pulse hammered. If anyone caught him altering a flight control system without authorization, it would mean a court-martial, maybe prison. But if he didn't, Hayes would die like the others. He forced the Z-wire into place, pinned it tight, and tested the tension. The cable moved. No slack. Perfect. He sealed the panel, cleaned the blood from his hands and tools, and stepped outside into the still, humid night at 0115 hours. Somewhere beyond the airfield, engines droned. Maybe Japanese raiders. The sound made his stomach knot. What he'd done was illegal, reckless, maybe even suicidal. If the wire failed, it would kill Hayes. But if it held, it might save him. McKenna lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, waiting for morning.
At 0630, he stood on the flight line as crews fueled and armed the P-38. Hayes walked out for a briefing, climbed into the cockpit. At 0742, the aircraft roared into the sky, joining 16 others heading northwest toward enemy airspace. All McKenna could do was watch them fade into the light. The engagement began at 0814 over the Huon Gulf, 4 Lightnings diving from 13,000 feet into a formation of Japanese Zeros below. Hayes flew in the number 3 slot. Sun behind them, perfect conditions. They rolled into the attack. Hayes picked a target at the rear, dove to 380 miles per hour and pressed the trigger. The guns thundered. Tracers streaked out. A few sparks. Not enough. The Zero snapped right and dove away. Hayes followed, and that's when he felt it. The airplane obeyed instantly. No lag. No hesitation. The stick and wings moved as one. The lightning rolled through 90 degrees in half the time it used to. Hayes brought the Zero back into his sight, fired again. A burst tore through the enemy fuselage. The engine erupted in flame. The Zero flipped inverted, plunging toward the jungle below. Hayes' first kill. But there was no time to celebrate. His wingman shouted a warning. 3 Zeros diving from above. Hayes saw them coming fast, hunting revenge. He shoved the throttles forward, began to climb, but they were closing too quickly. Doctrine said to run. Instinct said to fight. He rolled hard left and pulled. The P-38 spun around like it had been waiting for him. The lead Zero overshot, caught off guard by the speed of Hayes' reversal. Hayes squeezed the trigger, round struck the left wing root, and the enemy disintegrated mid-air. 2 kills in seconds. The remaining pair tried to scissor, alternating turns to force an overshoot, but Hayes stayed locked in. Every roll, every pull, the Lightning answered instantly. It felt like a new aircraft, alive, unchained. 1 Zero bled too much speed in a reversal. Hayes cut inside, close to point-blank range, and fired. The burst shredded it apart. Debris slammed into his right boom as he flew through the wreckage. 3 victories. The 4th enemy broke away and fled. Hayes didn't chase. Fuel and ammo were nearly gone. He climbed, rejoined the survivors, and headed home. The fight lasted just 7 minutes. When Hayes landed at Dobodura at 0903, McKenna was waiting. The young pilot shut down, climbed out trembling, drenched in sweat. He walked straight to McKenna, met his eyes, and said only 2 words. It worked. Neither man knew that 6 other pilots had witnessed the engagement from above. Captain Frank Mitchell, a veteran flight leader with the 475th, had watched from 15,000 feet and noticed something strange. Hayes' Lightning was rolling faster than any P-38 he'd ever seen. The aircraft seemed half its normal weight. Hayes was good, but no one was that good. Something had changed. Later, during debriefing, Mitchell asked Hayes about it. Hayes, still wired from combat, said his plane simply responded better, faster, cleaner. Mitchell pressed him about maintenance. Hayes told him to talk to Technical Sergeant McKenna. 2 hours later, Mitchell found McKenna back in the hangar, working silently on another Lightning. McKenna's hands were black with grease, his coveralls streaked with oil and hydraulic stains when Captain Mitchell approached. Without preamble, Mitchell asked, "What exactly did you do to Hayes' airplane?" McKenna stared at him for a long moment before replying. He told him everything. The piano wire tensioner, the altered cable, the unauthorized change to the flight controls. Mitchell listened in silence, arms folded. When McKenna finished, Mitchell's response was simple. Could he do the same for his own plane? McKenna hesitated. Yes, he could, but Mitchell needed to understand what it meant. The fix wasn't sanctioned, wasn't tested, and if anything went wrong, both of them could face serious charges. Mitchell didn't care. He'd already buried 4 pilots from his flight in the past month, all lost in turning fights they couldn't escape. If this modification could be them even a sliver of advantage, he wanted it. Regulations, he said, could wait until the war was over. That evening, McKenna installed the same piano wire tensioner in Mitchell's P-38. The next morning, Mitchell took the aircraft up and came back electrified. He told his wingman it handled like a different machine, like a fighter instead of a truck. The wingman immediately wanted the change too. By August 20th, McKenna had modified 9 aircraft. The word spread fast. Pilots whispered about it in the ready room. Crew chiefs traded stories over maintenance benches. Some refused outright, citing regulations. Others nodded quietly and asked McKenna how it was done. Cut the piano wire, bend it into a Z, fit it in line, takes 8 minutes, and the airplane comes alive. The change moved through the squadrons like rumor and gospel combined. No paperwork, no orders, just quiet confidence, passed between men who'd seen it work. Hayes shot down 2 more Zeros on August 22nd with his tuned controls. Mitchell claimed 3 kills on the 25th. Pilots began returning from sorties with victory tallies instead of excuses. The pattern was unmistakable. Lieutenant James Watkins,
A crew chief with the 49th Fighter Group at Gasop heard about it from a pilot recently transferred from Dobodura. Skeptical but curious, he tried it on one aircraft. The pilot came back from his next mission with his first confirmed kill in 8 weeks of combat. Watkins modified 4 more planes. Other mechanics in the 49th followed suit. By early September, at least 40 Lightnings across New Guinea carried the secret adjustment. The engineering officers noticed the results, but couldn't pinpoint the cause. During inspections, everything appeared standard. Cable tensions read within limits because the crew chiefs quietly removed the tensioners beforehand and reinstalled them afterward. The pilots knew. The mechanics knew. The officers didn't ask. And the kill ratios began to shift. In July, American P-38 units in the Southwest Pacific lost 2 aircraft for every 0 destroyed. By August, the ratio was 1.3 to 1. In September, it was nearly even. Something unseen had tipped the balance. The Japanese noticed too. Late in August, pilots of the 11th Air Fleet began reporting that American P-38s were maneuvering differently, rolling faster, reversing direction with unnatural quickness. Tactics that had worked flawlessly for months suddenly failed. Among those who noticed was Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, Japan's most celebrated ace with 64 confirmed kills. On September 3, 1943, Sakai tangled with a Lightning over Wewak. He used his trusted tactic, lure the American into a turn, wait for the sluggish roll, then snap back and cut inside. But this time, the P-38 reversed with him. It shouldn't have been possible. Sakai knew exactly how long the Lightning's roll took. He'd measured it with his life countless times, but this one moved too fast. He barely dodged a head-on collision, and the American got guns on him. Sakai dove away in shock, shaken in a way no duel had ever left him. Soon, other veteran Japanese pilots reported the same unnerving encounters. The Americans hadn't changed their tactics. Their aircraft had changed, just enough to ruin the timing Japanese pilots had mastered. Fractions of a second, but fatal ones. Japanese intelligence tried to uncover the cause. They inspected wrecked P-38s, searching for differences. Nothing. The engines were standard. The guns are the same. Every visible feature matched. The secret, hidden deep inside the boom, was a 6-inch strip of piano wire that looked like it belonged there. Even if they'd found it, they might not have understood its purpose. It wasn't a new weapon or an engine upgrade, just a tweak to cable tension. But that minor fix was cutting down their finest aviators. By mid-September, Japanese losses against P-38s surged to levels not seen since the war's early days. The psychological blow was immense. For 2 years, Zero pilots had ruled the skies in turning fights, confident they could outmaneuver anything the Americans sent up. Now that certainty was cracking. Pilots, once fearless, were hesitating, second-guessing their instincts. Some adapted by avoiding turning fights altogether, adopting hit-and-run tactics. But that meant abandoning the Zero's greatest edge, agility, and fighting on American terms, where the heavier, faster, better-armed P-38 reigned. Others tried doubling down, pressing closer before firing, gambling on aggression. Those gambles ended in fire and smoke. Veterans who'd survived since 1942 were dying in battles they would have once dominated. The enemy was changing, invisibly. The Japanese could feel it, but couldn't see it, couldn't counter it. You can't fight what you don't know exists. By the end of September, the 11th Air Fleet had lost 38 fighters in combat with P-38s, while American losses stood at 22. For the first time in the Pacific War, the Lightning held the advantage, killing Zeros at better than 1-to-1. Japanese command finally issued a grim directive: avoid combat with P-38s unless holding overwhelming numerical superiority. That order marked the moment the hunter became the hunted.
and it all traced back to a sliver of piano wire no one was ever supposed to install. The modification never became official. The Army Air Force's Engineering Command only discovered it in October 1943 when a maintenance inspector at WW2 found inconsistent cable tension readings and followed them back to the improvised tensioners. He filed a report and sent it up the chain. It sat on desks for 3 weeks while officers debated what to do. Despite violating every regulation in the manual, the modification worked. Squadrons that used it were seeing a measurable rise in victory counts. Pilots were coming home alive. The real question wasn't whether it was effective, it was what to do about the men who had installed it without permission. Punish them or quietly make it official. In November, Lockheed engineers arrived in New Guinea to inspect the unapproved change. They measured the new cable tensions, ran stress calculations, and conducted flight trials. Their verdict was clear. The design was stable, safe, and should have existed from the start. Lockheed soon added a similar tensioning system to the new P-38J models, entering production that December. Yet, James McKenna received no official credit. No medal, no citation, no mention in any report. In Lockheed's paperwork, the improvement was simply listed as an engineering refinement.
Hayes survived the war, flying 63 combat missions and downing 11 Japanese aircraft. He returned to Iowa in 1945, married his high school sweetheart, raised 4 children, and spent nearly 4 decades crop dusting the same fields he'd once dreamed of leaving. Every August 17th, without fail, he called McKenna to thank him for saving his life. Mitchell survived as well. He rose to command his own squadron, leading through the Philippines campaign and claiming 16 victories. After the war, he remained in the Air Force, retiring as a colonel in 1963. To every young maintenance officer under him, he repeated the same lesson, that sometimes the best innovations come from mechanics who see what the engineers overlook. McKenna stayed in the service until 1946 before returning to California. In 1948, he opened a small garage in Long Beach where he repaired engines for 42 years. He rarely spoke about the war. When asked, he'd simply say, "I fixed airplanes." In 1991, a military historian researching P-38 maintenance logs stumbled across the mysterious piano-wired tensioner. Tracking McKenna down through veteran records, he found him still working part-time at age 73. When questioned about the modification, McKenna shrugged it off. It wasn't anything special, he said. It just needed doing. The historian later estimated that his small invention might have saved between 80 and 100 American pilots. McKenna never kept count. He only remembered the faces that came back. Hayes, Mitchell, Watkins, and the rest. That was enough. James McKenna passed away in 2006 at the age of 88. He was laid to rest in Pacific View Memorial Park, California. His obituary mentioned his wartime service as an aircraft mechanic, but not the piano wire, not the change he made to American fighters, not the rule he broke to save lives. His old garage in Long Beach still stands, under new ownership. On the back wall of its office hangs a faded photograph, a young mechanic beside a P-38 Lightning. The note on the back reads, New Guinea, August 1943. That's how innovation truly happens in war, not through committees or paperwork, but through the hands of men who see a problem, find a solution, and act before permission arrives. If this story moved you as much as it did us, take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten histories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold accounts, each one a small piece of something larger, each one worth remembering. And tell us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to lifelong history enthusiasts. Thank you for watching and for helping keep these stories alive.